spread the herd around. So what the U.S. actually also uses, and kind of the term even is so-called carousel tariffs. So we kind of every 6 months we change who in that foreign country we affect. So in the U.S. versus Europe would be, for instance, 6 months, for instance, handbags. So to affect Gucci and these Italian companies, or fancy mineral water, or fancy cheeses, and so on. So really to spread the herd around all over Europe, so that then within the European Union they kind of the politicians get kind of in trouble locally, and will change their mind on whether or not to I don't know, continue to protect.
One of the, I'd like to go back to something that you said at the very beginning, because you were talking about the distribution of jewelry, and why it was so hard to get people to retrain. And it struck me that one of the things about these areas, because I've lived in a lot of them, and I live in one of them now, is that, like Dr. Bashir's talk yesterday, you have weak states, i.e. weak economies, but you have strong societies. In other words, what keeps people there?
Yes. I mean, this is indeed.
You know, is the generally societal.
If you can just download it, that would be awesome.
Absolutely.
And then,
and maybe we should have listened to maybe sociologists more so, because that is something that we really only discovered recently.
Because I'm down.
Historically, and to a certain extent, in the past that was empirically true, but we just kind of saw this at some point and continue to believe it, is that the U.S. population is incredibly mobile. So along the lines, if you lose your job in Mississippi, next week you start in Massachusetts.
no, you don't. You go.
And in practice, that's no longer the case. So in the past was more the case than today, and that's a bad development because it makes the U.S. actually more than Europe. Because the one big reason of kind of why Europe has not making as much progress or not benefiting from the European Union as much as some people hope was exactly for lack of mobility. But the explanation there is, of course, language. Yeah? So you're Portuguese, you can't just move to Finland, even though legally you can, but you can't just take a customer interaction job in Finland.
In those countries, most people know 4 or 5 languages because borders and stuff. But still,
I mean,
when you get settled,
I mean, even with the introduction of the euro, kind of there's this so-called concept of a collective optimal currency area, so kind of whether or not the euro was a good idea in the first place. And some of this was related to, for instance, lack of mobility.
natural human suspicion of
Where are they going to archive these recordings?
I assume
they go to
friends and family. And
Okay. Yeah.
But where I live right now, very, very heavily into Latino, and about 40% of city.
Well, I mean, that shows mobility because these people were actually willing to move all the way to.
Well, no, most of them are. Where I live, they were there before the Angels began.
Oh, okay. So it's not recent immigrants from Central Europe, Central America. Okay.
Most of these are, New Mexico.
Okay. Yeah. Of course.
It's a long time indigenous and whatever.
Well, I don't know, but Utah could have been Mexican.
I live in Aberdeen, and I just saw a little part of news where they're so small, but I just saw this and the big welcome and exit sign. And two languages. No, it's like because the condition like I always think of camera like why do you have to pin?
Can you hear
Double
us?
your cost painting signs and you gotta do this.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely costly.
And then the other thing is it's not encouraging they all want to be
I mean, that's a tricky discussion, of course, to have because there are, I mean, there are economic arguments for.
Are you talking to me? That works fine, thanks.
Because your accent doesn't seem German to me.
Thank you, maybe.
Well, he's got kind of a German name.
So what do I sound like?
I don't know, I couldn't place it.
I see, okay. I would have been angry if it was Austrian or so, I don't know.
I wouldn't know the difference.
The microphone for him isn't there, but I
I should be able to project over here.
Okay, so just.
Okay, I think I have to disappear here. No, I'm not disappearing, but something that was happening me once again.
Like,
Well, no, I can't.
You're a young guy.
Morning, by the way.
Morning.
Snow is good. Snow is water. Water is life. We need more. We need more. Oh, maybe it's down the valley. If it's snowing up in the mountains, that's what it counts. Oh, yeah, no worries. Gives me a chance to gather. I was under the impression to read this whole thing. It gives me a chance to read over highlights.
Yeah, don't read the whole thing.
Okay, I'll just sit and do it.
There's this one, this, because there's getting.
I'll just sit and do it.
Awesome.
Yep.
Well, I don't have to go anywhere. Yeah, well, you may well make it to a process. Yeah. It's the same street. Oh, that's right, we passed it.
So Shadman wants to go last, right? Shadman wants to go last.
Sure, I can go first if you want. Or do you want to do the Skype person first?
I'll do you, and then I'll do Stuart Ingersoll.
Skype person has limited moving. Has to look interesting.
Okay, yeah.
So he has breaks in between. Why am I getting yelled at? I was not the last up here.
That's my screens. Pass me that water back, please. Awesome, thank you very much.
You can come closer.
All right, good morning, everyone. Morning. All right, so this is our panel on global governance. Our first speaker for this panel will be Dr. Malliga. She is an assistant professor in global studies and languages here at Idaho State. Her research focuses on women in conservative parties and the diversity of women's representation in Europe and the Anglosphere countries. She's the co-editor of The Right Women, Republican Activist Candidates and Lawmakers, and the former research director of Political Parity, a program of the Hunt Alternative Fund, where she supervised research projects exploring innovative strategies to increase the number of women in U.S. politics. I'm asking each speaker to go for about 15 minutes. Go a few over if you like. I'll start waving paper at you if you go too much over. So, Malliga, all you.
Well, I'm very excited to be here.
That's
This
all.
one is off.
Yeah, there's one right there, the wireless one.
Hello. Oh, hello. Perfect. So, I have a PowerPoint. Robert, I might have to minimize you. I'm sorry. Don't feel offended. Do we have a clicker? See, we're almost, this doesn't count towards my time. Get 1 minute extra.
Actually, it gives me that reminded me I should check what time you're starting to talk.
Okay, start now.
Go for it.
So, is there an echo or is it just me? You're good? Okay. So, I'm going to talk about global governance from a very different perspective. When we talk about global governance, we usually consider the diffusion of human rights norms internationally, how we solve global crises, how we address climate change as a world government. Oh, sorry, there is no world government. Everyone, don't freak out. As a world community together. However, in some cases, this is not necessarily possible. So,
Is it turned on?
no?
Is there a little thing to plug into the laptop?
I've done that.
You're holding it upside down.
That shouldn't matter.
This is my lucky clicker.
Your lucky clicker?
Yeah,
Okay.
should work.
Molly, do me a favor and just do that. So, here I have listed a couple of international human rights treaties that nope, okay, I'm just going to ignore them. That we have seen around the world that have come into existence after World War II. We do have the Convention Against Racial Discrimination. We have, of course, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Migrant Workers, Persons with a Disability, and a Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People. Today, I'm going to talk about specifically the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Some of you might know that the US is one of only 7 countries that have not ratified CEDAW. The only other countries who have not ratified CEDAW are the Pacific Island nations of Tonga and Palau, as well as Iran, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. So, CEDAW was signed by President Carter in 1981 and then following introduced into the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to be ratified. However, from the beginning, it faced really strong opposition by the Republicans and the pro-life lobby, especially Republicans and Senator Holmes. I believe he has passed away since then. However, the opposition to CEDAW still has not declined. So there has been a constant roadblock against CEDAW ratification for the past 30 years. And CEDAW is not the only international rights treaty that the US has abstained from. The other international human rights treaties the US is not part of is the rights of the child. Funny enough, one of the reasons the US has refused to ratify is that the convention bans countries from trying children as adults or imposing death penalty on children. The International Criminal Court, the Mine Ban Treaty, Disabled People, and the Optional Protocol to Torture, as well as the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. So this brings up the question, what happens when states refuse to ratify a treaty? And in the international studies literature, we talk about a boomerang model here. So in state A on the left, there is domestic opposition to an international human rights treaty. So the women's movement, in this case, is unable to convince the government to ratify CEDAW. So what typically happens is that these NGOs, these women's rights organizations, go outside, reach out to partners in other countries, which then pressure more receptive states to pressure state A. So the idea here would be that women's rights organizations and activists in the US reach out to allies in Canada, Europe, Australia, and other countries in the world. These allies then encourage their government to pressure the US to change their minds or go through the United Nations and other international organizations to do so. However, the US is not any ordinary country. What happens if states are immune to international pressure? And this is essentially what is happening in the US. The boomerang is broken for the US because it doesn't matter if the US is public shamed, it's so powerful that it's immune to public shaming. So the Cities for CEDA campaign is actually one that emerged out of this immunity to international public shaming. It is an inward-looking human rights strategy where essentially the American women rights activists said, you know what, forget the US government, it's not going to happen, or it's unlikely to happen. And for now, we are trying to bring CEDA to the United States by simply going around the federal government. At the same time, we are trying to create bottom-up pressure on the Senate. So the idea here is that CEDA, its main principle, substantive equality and the principle of non-discrimination based on sex, are implemented in municipal codes. So the Cities for CEDA coalition encourages individual cities in the US to become CEDA citizens and adopt CEDA ordinances. So this essentially means that the idea of substantive equality, so gender equality not just in opportunities but also in outcomes, a very non-American approach, to be honest, is included in municipal ordinances, as well as the direct rules on how not to discriminate based on sex. So this Cities for CEDA campaign was launched in 2013 after San Francisco actually became the first CEDA city in 1998. So San Francisco has led the way as a CEDA city. And the coalition was led, or is still led, by the Women's Intercultural Network in partnership with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the Leadership Conference Education Fund, and the NGO Committee on the Status of Women in New York. So to this day, we have 7 ordinances, 20 cities with CEDA resolutions, and 33 active campaigns. And this map is courtesy of Molly Drabin over here, who is doing an internship with UNA, the United Nations Association in Denver, where I'm the co-chair for the Denver for CEDA campaign. So she has been instrumental in putting together a policy report for the Denver Women's Office for Women and Families to inform, hopefully, ordinance in Denver. We're not there yet. But as you can see, we have a few CEDA ordinance cities. We also have resolutions. However, resolutions are just legal aspiration. They are not legally binding. They are just policy aspiration that cities want to do if they can. An ordinance is actually legally binding, so of course we would rather have legal ordinances. The idea when the Cities for CEDA campaign started is that we would have 100 cities for CEDA across the US to take away some of the arguments against ratifying CEDA. So the idea is, if in every state we have a handful of CEDA cities and the sky hasn't fallen in, then we can go back to the senators for those states and saying, listen, you think CEDA will destroy traditional family values, but look at Cincinnati. It has now a CEDA ordinance, and traditional families are alive and well. So this is also the idea of a bottom-up strategy. Whether this is going to work is unlikely. The emphasis, I believe, that is more successful is really on this inward-looking strategy to bring CEDA to cities. So what does the CEDA ordinance actually include? It includes a gender analysis of the city, where the city has to take stock about the city's department and policies and programs, how many women are hired in every position, how many women rise up to management level, how are women paid comparative to men. Is there discrimination based on parental leave? Is there family leave available? But it also means looking at the situation of women in the city itself. Where do women face the greatest discrimination? For example, what is the response time to domestic violence calls on average? What can the city do to improve those response times? Or if there's a big immigrant community, what languages are spoken, and are there enough translators available for women if they want to file complaints that they can do so if they don't speak English? So these are all issues that can come up in a gender analysis, and generally a city decides where to put the emphasis. Some have just looked at the community overall, some have looked at the city specifically, and some have looked at city operation plus the situation of residents in the city. The second part here is that every city needs to establish an oversight body. And many cities actually already have women's commissions or committee for women. So often this is the natural location where to put the CEDA ordinance monitoring body. Some cities have created a CEDA task force, especially in the beginning. Others have, DC is considering placing it with the Human Rights Commission because it is a human rights issue, and they already have a well-funded Human Rights Commission that can take over the monitoring mechanism. The other part is funding the support of CEDA implementation. Changing policies costs money. So the Cities for CEDA campaign suggests anywhere between 5 cents and 25 cents per female residence to be set aside in every budget to fund CEDA ordinance implementation, whether it's to conduct a gender analysis or having to implement implementation costs for the city. So what does this actually mean in detail? Molly also did a legal analysis with the help of our legal advisor. And every ordinance has specific content. And we were able to identify 3 types of content. First, target population. Second, goals. And third, execution. The target population is who's benefiting from the CEDA ordinance. Of course, women. But many cities have got a step further saying intersectionality really matters. It's not just any women. We need to look how gender equality plays out for women of color, for disabled women, for poor women, for immigrant women, for gay women. So taking the step saying that gender equality is not the same for every woman, but it matters who you are and where you're situated in your economic or racial context, matters a lot for any outcomes on gender equality. Goals are surprisingly homogeneous across all cities for CEDA. So we have 7 CEDA ordinances right now, and maybe Molly has to help me out, but it's San Francisco, Cincinnati, Miami-Dade, Honolulu, Los Angeles, Berkeley, and Pittsburgh, I believe. Pittsburgh sounds right? Okay. So across all of them, they pick the same kind of issues they want to focus on. So the ordinance says we want to achieve gender equality, affirm the principle of non-discrimination. Specifically, we want to address X. And for most cities, this is very similar. Sexual violence, domestic violence, and pay inequality or workplace discrimination. These are issues that are already being talked about in cities on the issue of women's rights in the US or civil rights. However, few cities form it as human rights issues. And that's one of the challenges coming into a local city saying you should have an ordinance based on CEDA because the benefits of an international treaty are not readily apparent. Why should a city adopt an international treaty? And why would a city adopt, 30 articles or however are in CEDA and then implement it word by word? That's not the case. The ordinance is supposed to capture the spirit of CEDA, the principle of substantive equality, the principle of non-discrimination, and then it's up to the city to decide where to put the emphasis and how to implement it. So it's not about implementing CEDA word by word. It's the spirit of CEDA and having legal guarantees, which one of the benefit is that if it's just a resolution or a declaration, it really depends on the mayor or the city council whether they are feminist advocates on the city council and how are they staffed. Having an ordinance makes it much more permanent as a structure and mainstreams gender equality concerns into the operations. And then the ordinance often also designates the execution, so the oversight body, who is in charge of conducting the gender analysis and who is in charge of developing recommendations based on the gender analysis and who's making sure that the city council actually acts upon those recommendations. Gender analysis are complicated and they are often expensive. So many cities have partnered with local universities who provided in-kind donation, free labor by faculty, to conduct those gender analysis in the form of research assistantships, etc. So in Cincinnati, in Miami-Dade, Florida International University has stepped up. In New Orleans, it was Tulane University, where there were researchers who were interested. And then what is most fascinating about Cities for CEDA, and that's where it comes back to global governance, is that international meetings actually play a central role in diffusing the idea of Cities for CEDA throughout the US. So in 2 weeks or 1 week? 2 weeks, I think. The United Nations Committee on the Status of Women annual meeting is starting in New York. And many of the women's rights activists in the US who came up with this idea of Cities for CEDA, for example, Krishanti Damarash, who is now the executive director at the Center for Global Leadership in Rutgers, or Sun Young Un, who has worked, I have to cut off now?
You have 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. Who works with the NGO CSW New York and serves on the board of the National Democratic Institute, or Joanne Kaufman-Ward, who was the director of the Human Rights Center at Columbia. They are all involved in these issues. And these are women, what in the international literature we call rooted cosmopolitans. These are women rights activists that have a strong domestic agenda and involvement in trying to push women rights issues or other issues on a domestic agenda, but they have close links with the transnational global governance network, where they interact with women rights activists around the world, come together, come up with ideas. So it was these women who thought especially after Beijing and the Platform for Action, saying we need to bring CEDA to the US, we don't want to wait any longer, and Krishanti was really instrumental in bringing CEDA to San Francisco in 1998. So the UN CSW meeting every year serves as a platform for these women and other organizations to talk about Cities for CEDA. Cities for CEDA has parallel events, has panels during those 2 weeks, and those women speak on several other issues because they don't just do Cities for CEDA, right? They work on many different women rights issues. And it comes up that they're working for Cities for CEDA. People who attend UN CSW are usually members of other nonprofit organizations, so the International Association of Sociology Professors, or Women Waging Peace, or anything you can, the American Association of University Women. So they come in capacity for these organizations. However, they then learn about Cities for CEDA, and most people do not know that CEDA exists or that the US has not ratified CEDA, and it usually blows their minds. And they become very upset when they learn about it. And then they hear about Cities for CEDA. And often they go back and say, this can't happen, and we're going to do Cities for CEDA in our hometown. So you see organizations taking the lead that didn't come for Cities for CEDA to the UN meeting, but they left with Cities for CEDA as an idea for their hometown. So there is a diffusion of the idea, there's a learning about the Cities for CEDA, meeting other people. So I'm going out to New York for the Cities for CEDA meeting, and that will help me to connect with others who are active in cities who already have successful ordinances, to learn about implementation challenges, how to navigate roadblocks, etc. So we learn from each other during the meeting. But then also we go home, and hopefully there will be not 33 active campaigns, but maybe 50 after this UN meeting. I'm very optimistic here. And what is also interesting is that the structure on how the CEDA ordinance is established mirrors very closely the global governance structure for CEDA. So for states, once they ratify the treaty, they are obligated to submit periodic gender analysis reports, where they say, this is how we're doing, well, this is where our shortcomings are. They usually don't play them. And then the CEDA committee looks through those reports and say, these are the recommendations we give you, State X, in order to improve gender equality and come better in line with CEDA implementation. So the periodic state reports are really what we, at the municipal level, are this gender analysis. And ideally, we do them every couple of years. So San Francisco has done them every couple of years, and has done essentially a gender audit of several departments, fire department, police department, department for women, to see where gender equality is for each department. And then the oversight body, the CEDA committee, consists of experts on women's rights from all over the world who evaluate the situation in a country, and they also accept reports from NGOs, because of course we know that states will embellish how well they are doing and downplay their shortcomings. So to make sure that it's a more realistic account, we have NGO or shadow reports submitted by NGOs or individuals and countries that say, well, actually, this is what really is happening. And so they get a full picture. And here, we have a CEDA task force. We don't necessarily need NGO shadow reports on the local level because NGOs are already so instrumental in bringing the CEDA ordinance to cities as well as helping creating the gender analysis reports. And as I already mentioned, civil society involvement is really instrumental for CEDA on the international level. They pressure states to implement CEDA better, they remind them about their obligations, and so what we have on the municipal level is local nonprofits taking the charge, such as the AAUW, the United Nations Association, or business professional women. So in conclusion, the global governance actually happens in local context. You don't have to think about global governance in this international dimension. You can actually think about global governance as being applicable to local context and using human rights as frames and strategies to address domestic issues. The inward-looking human rights strategy seems to be the only one working right now in the US, because if you were unable to get a vote on CEDA on the Senate floor under Obama, it won't happen in the next 4 to 8 years, or any other Democratic president, whoever comes after Trump. So, and we also need to do CEDA cities not as an isolated case. There is actually a general movement towards human rights cities. You've probably heard about the climate coalition among cities, where when Trump pulled out of the Paris Environmental Agreement, they said, we don't care. As cities, we still commit to doing it. Seattle is very prominent as a human rights city. They refer back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the Convention on Racial Discrimination. And there are human rights cities in the US, such as Boston and Washington, D.C., that use human rights standards in their everyday local politics. So if you want to learn more how Pocatello become a CEDA city, let me know. I'm happy to talk to you, and that's it from me for now.
All right, thank you so much, Malliga. And I think we can make the PowerPoint go away, and we can bring Robert back now.
Robert. And I should say that Robert was one of the kindred souls that I sent out a Hail Mary to all my networks saying we had a panelist cancel. Can anyone within the next 24 hours either tomorrow fly out or willing to be on Skype? And he actually answered the call. So.
All right, well, I almost feel like I don't need to introduce him now, since Malliga just made him sound like such a wonderful person for answering that call that I ignored.
He was not on the groups I sent it out to.
I was.
Oh, shame on Shane.
I just didn't fit the description of what you were looking for.
Fair enough.
All right. Anyways, this wonderful person we're talking about is Dr. Robert Stewart Ingersoll. Dr. Stewart Ingersoll's research focuses on national and international security, human rights, and the creation and effects of widely held ideas about the relationship between society and security. He's published and spoken on the subject of global and regional security orders, increasing role of regional powers in both of these areas, and the causes and effects of varied management approaches to comparable security issues across different regional settings. So with that being said, Robert, it's all you.
Thank you. Much appreciated. I'm glad to be here, and I'm happy that I was able to answer that call. Just a quick question: are my slides coming through?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, wonderful. All right, so I'm going to broaden way back out in terms of the aperture I'm looking at this, the issue of U.S. foreign policy in the 21st century from. And I'm going to focus on it within the context of broad national security strategy at a time in which I would argue that the international order was already at a moment of crisis prior to the election of the current administration, and the approach that the current administration has taken so far is cause for significant concern. To begin with, I include on this header slide a screenshot of the cover of the National Security Strategy. And fortunately, for us, we have a clear sense of at least how the Trump national security strategy is proceeding, as it's one of the few, or maybe the only administration who managed to actually get the national security strategy out on time, as it's outlined in the goal statute. However, the approach that is taken in that national security strategy is one that appears to be more adversarial in its approach to the international order than previous administrations, and this is cause, I would argue, for significant concern. And so I want to start out by maybe a cautionary tale. And this is a painting by William Pullman Hunt from the 1850s. And there's a story that goes along with this painting. And it's told by Prince Bernhard von Bülow, who was the German chancellor between 1900 and 1909. And he's speaking about his reflection of talking to Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, who was the chancellor of Germany from 1909 to 1917, so when World War I started. And he's talking about an interaction that he had with Bethmann-Hollweg shortly after the war started. And he says, Bethmann-Hollweg stood in the center of the room. Shall I ever forget his face, the look in his eyes? There's a picture by some celebrated English painter which shows the wretched scapegoat with a look of ineffable anguish in its eyes. Such pain as I now saw in Bethlehem. For an instant, we neither of us spoke. At last, I said to him, well, tell me at least how it all happened. He raised his long, thin arms to heaven and answered in a dull, exhausted voice, oh, if I only knew. In many later polemics on war guilt, I have often wished it had been possible to produce a snapshot of Bethmann-Hollweg, standing there at the moment he said these words. Such a photograph would have been the best proof that this wretched man never wanted. I raise this as a cautionary tale at this moment because I would argue that we are in the midst of a crisis of international order. It's a moment of crisis of the legitimacy of the international order that has maintained stability between great powers for the past 73 years. And it's coinciding at a moment when its leading state in its creation and management for that period of time is also in the midst of a crisis. Current statements and policies by the U.S. administration do not provide hopeful indicators that the U.S. understands the nature of this crisis or that it's prepared to provide leadership in correcting it. And this is particularly problematic given that the crisis is about legitimacy of the order itself and of its leadership. This makes for a volatile moment for the United States and the international system more generally. And so when we look at the approach of the U.S. toward international order in the post-World War II era, primarily the preference has been for a rules-based international order based on liberal principles. And to be fair, the United States has had a somewhat ambivalent relationship with that international order from the beginning, and we could see that from the previous speaker's comments about CEDAW and the rights of the child. But still, it has provided leadership. It has exercised a level of self-restraint that it didn't need to, given its preponderance of power over this period of time. And it's recognized that its long-term strategic interests benefit more by this order being effective and preventing major power war than it is by pursuing its short-term interests. The problem is that over the course of particularly the post 9/11 period, the United States has veered increasingly away from limiting its own actions in accordance with the rules of the game that it has set. And this is missed, in my experience, this is missed most seriously by only Americans. In my conversations, in my teaching outside of the United States, there's no mystery about this. And the view of the United States' role in the world is far less benevolent than the United States likes to view itself as. And so this has created a fundamental rift and fundamental questions about the legitimacy of the United States as it determines that it alone can violate, for instance, the Convention Against Torture, that it alone has the authority to invade other countries throughout the Middle East, that it alone has this responsibility as the benevolent hegemon to act internationally. This has created a real fracture within the international order. Now, when we talk about the international order, what we're talking about is the what we're talking about is the governing arrangement among states and other actors within the international system, which are designed to make interactions predictable. Right? That's the key. And to sustain goals and values that states, members of the international community, have determined are worth sustaining and protecting. Obviously, the foremost among these prevent another world war. Now, the international order is influenced by a host of different things, but particularly it's influenced by the structure of the international system, that is the distribution of power among its major players. It's influenced by the ongoing process, the pattern of interactions among its participants, and it's influenced by its most powerful actors, their behavior. The most powerful actors in the international system not only generate orders, but they also manage and maintain orders, or they don't, and orders collapse. And so at certain points in time, those collapses happen. Now, these collapses can occur as a result of rapid shifts in the distribution of power amongst major states, or they can happen because of changes in behavior and sort of the logic of interaction amongst particularly the most powerful states. Quite frequently, though not always, these collapses of order happen in conjunction with what have come to be called world wars or great power wars. The one exception to that in the pictures that I show here, I show the Congress of Vienna at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Yalta Conference at the end of World War II, the Paris Conference at the end of World War I, and the collapse of the Berlin Wall. That's the only case, systemic chain in the past 200 years that has not involved major power war. Now, the question is, do we see a major shift going on in the structure of the international system? Well, as you can see, if we look at military spending as a sort of indicator of the distribution of power, the most powerful states collectively do not match up with the military expenditures of the United States, and that's before the massive increase of the past few weeks. We can see that over time in the post-Cold War period, There is a fluctuation in terms of particularly U.S. military spending and the position of China, which is that orange line, which is on the increase slope toward the United States. But in no way do we see anything approaching parity or any level of equality between these two states. And so while there is a shift going on in terms of power distribution, that doesn't, the crisis, I would argue, in the international order is more driven by behavior and by process. And here, what we see is a move by the United States not only to approach the international order from sort of its traditional ambivalent perspective, but one that is actually adversarial. And if you look at the national security strategy that came out in December of 2017, you see the language of adversarial relationship to the international order. And you see this manifested in things like yesterday's announcement on tariffs, which go directly against the principles of open and free trade that are the basis of the economic international order. You see this in support for the actions of authoritarian rulers throughout the international system, such as President Duterte of the Philippines, and their approach to dealing with human rights and issues of law and order. You see it in the combative language that the United States uses toward the United Nations and the belligerent language that it uses with respect to its perceived threats, particularly at the moment, North Korea and Iran. And I'm happy to elaborate on any of these points, but I recognize I'm going to run out of time. And so the crisis itself of the international order, I would say, falls into three areas of contestation. The first is that the international system doesn't really look like how we've conceptualized it since World War II, and it is really more of a system of systems. It is a system. There is this global logic. There is a set of global rule sets, but for most states, in terms of their security interests, their relevant partners or adversaries are more local. And so what you have is a series of regional systems operating within this broader system. And this gives rise to contestation between regional powers and global powers about who has legitimate leadership within a particular geographical area. Second of all, there is contestation about the way the ideology that the international order should be designed around, particularly in local contexts. And my experience in the Middle East tells me that they have a very, very, very different idea of what the international order should look like, particularly in the Gulf and Middle East regions, than a liberal human rights, individual liberty, open economy focus that has been the basis of the international order. And then finally, there's a contestation over whether or not the international order as designed in 1945 is effective for dealing with problems of the 21st century, and whether or not the United States is capable and the institutions are capable of adapting and acting in accordance with that leadership, or with that order. And so what we have is a pushback, which is manifesting itself as a threat at certain fault lines. Again, North Korea is a clear fault line. Syria and the broader Middle East is a fault line. Ukraine continues to be a fault line. You have, on one hand, a lack of clarity by the leadership of the current order that it is really behind a liberal order, and you have the beginnings of an offering of alternatives. Not a coherent alternative of an order, but certainly pushback from significant players, particularly Russia, against the international order as it's existed. This is a problem, given that, particularly with the liberal order that is based on rules and self-restraint, legitimacy is essential. It is not possible to maintain a liberal order simply as a function of military power. And unfortunately, this seems to be the direction that U.S. strategic thinking has moved over the past 17 years. There's a lot of talk within the strategic community about 4 types of power that the United States has. And this is what I mean by DIME: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. While the United States has, over recent years, increasingly rely on its military capability to impose order, it hasn't been entirely effective at doing that. And I would argue that this is a problem because the issue at stake is one of ideas. It is one of legitimacy. And it is one that the United States can most effectively remedy and reform if it moves to far more heavy reliance on its diplomatic and informational capabilities. Am I optimistic that this is the direction that the United States is going? As I've indicated so far, no. I'm not. The national security strategy does not indicate that. Over the past week, Secretary of Defense James Mattis said of the recent budget increase, I'm very confident that the Congress is now done with what the Congress has now done, and the President is going to allocate to us in the budget, is what we need to bring us back to a position of primacy. I would argue that this is precisely the mindset that will exacerbate the current crisis. It is indeed a pushback against this impulse toward primacy that is causing problems with the international order. And so doubling down on a sort of militaristic approach to maintaining U.S. position and international order is doomed to fail. And unfortunately, it's also likely to end up creating conflicts that we don't really want to be engaged in. So I'll stop for there.
All right, thank you very much, Robert. Our next speaker comes to us from Dixie State University. Shadman Bashir was born and raised in northwestern Pakistan. His law degrees from Pakistan in both English and Islamic law. His postgraduate degree in law from California Western School of Law in comparative law with focuses on telecommunications. At Dixie State, he teaches courses in criminal law, global law, war and terrorism. And Shadman, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
About 5 minutes.
Okay. Can I have the clicker, please?
Yes.
Can I have my PowerPoint? It's on a flash drive.
I will replace you with a PowerPoint again, Robert.
Yeah. Okay. It's not very early morning the way it was yesterday. I was a zombie yesterday. I wasn't sure if we were going to be using PowerPoints, but in the morning when I was making points for today, I said, you know what, why not turn them into a PowerPoint? Because I always think like a lawyer. I teach law, so I'm always thinking I have to sell my case to the jury. So I have to simplify it, I have to sell it, and I have to make them buy it. So when I think about globalization, for a second, imagine the world in two parts: the light and the dark, in broad meaning. And I don't mean to say that just because when I say it's bright, everything is right in there. No, but just for the argument, the world is in two parts, bright and dark. The way we have the internet, we have the regular internet, and we have the dark web. Does that mean that crimes only take place on the dark web? No. Crimes also take place and laws are broken on the regular internet. The world is parallel, which means that there is the regular globalization, organized, law and order, and the other one is the one which we hardly see, or we call it chaos. And movements, transactions, contracts that take place in chaos are completely different than the way they work in the non-chaos side of the world. And I'll explain it. There's only 6 points, so I'll see if this works. Okay. As I mentioned before, I'm not a scholar, I just teach law, and I always want to sell my case to the jury. So, sunny side up, an egg, the yolk and the white part, right? Imagine countries where the government is weak, but the society is strong. So the government is the yellow part, the yolk. The society, the larger part, is the white section. The best case scenario would be Afghanistan, Yemen, Africa, Asia, so many countries over there. Take that model and you apply that on the globe and it works perfectly. And again, if you have any questions, I'll try to sell my case on that. How does it work? When 9/11 happened, the idea was US goes to war in different parts of the world. That was one step. The second step was to protect the homeland. And there was a law called Homeland Security. A law came out and we all had to face it. That meant that either you were with or you were against. So if you were with, you were in that yellow part. If you were against, you were in the white part. And barriers were established. Immigration laws became more strict and they're even getting stricter to make sure that the yellow part throughout the globe is protected. And the more the jurisdiction of central government decreased, the more chaos increased. As the previous speaker mentioned, using military to enforce your will on other parts of the world hasn't proven to be very successful. Economics work. Same is the case in national and on international stage. The primary function of the government is to protect contracts. I'm here because of a contract, you are here because of a contract, we are all here because of a contract. And if those contracts cannot be protected between people, that triggers chaos. Anytime I see on the, when I study conflicts in different parts of the world, I hear this idea about it's because of resources, economics, intentions, religions, all of those kind of things. I hardly ever hear the word dispute resolution. And I don't mean dispute resolution between the governments, dispute resolutions between people who live in the white sections of the world or countries. Taliban. I've looked at many cases of the logic for Taliban being accepted in different parts of Afghanistan. And when you ask them, why are people accepting Taliban? A large chunk of people. Because Taliban have the ability to solve disputes quickly. Disputes are important. When you are living in a society where there's chaos, and someone can solve your dispute, which could have taken years, and they can do it faster, that is a very important point. And in many people, in many parts of the world where we think about the white section, the white part of the egg, disputes are really, really important because they are the ground level on which society is organized. I've had a chance to study this topic in detail, especially in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and I was shocked when I would hear people agreeing with Taliban or supporting Taliban. Yes, there was fear and all that stuff. I agree with that. But the other was, well, Taliban are able to settle our cases much quickly. And if you don't think about that in that manner, things are going to get messed up, and that's what's happening on the global scale. I'm going to just go quickly so that I can have more time for questions and answers. The other point when I think globalization, dark and light, terrorist fashion, and I'm using the word terrorist liberally. It means it includes everyone. It includes extremists, separatists, all of those things. Terrorist fashion also shows the global trend of violence in different parts of the world and how this is connected. You can go look at the terrorists of Boko Haram, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, northwestern Pakistan. You tend to find people dressed in similar outfits. And those outfits can be linked to the war of the 80s when Mujahideen were fighting against the Russians. So the way it's a depressing world. When people study fashion, Paris and London and all those things, I'm afraid I look at terrorists. I try to see what they're wearing, how they're wearing it, what kind of message they're portraying, and that gives you a signal on the global level, where are they getting their teachings and learnings and motivation from. So terrorist fashion is very, very important, which means in many parts of the world, you will realize militants dressed up in an outfit which is not native. So how did that outfit come in? Because this dark globalization that's happening on those levels, there's connections going on. So, and again, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer a little bit more detail. I wanted to put pictures, but I did that in a hurry, so I was like, let me just give you the points. The value of nationalism on the global scale, again, is different. Two things. The value of a Western passport has increased. The value of nationalism or nationalistic sentiment in the white section of the world has decreased. Which means in most cases that I've come across, that I've studied and read and researched, I realize many of the people in those parts of the world want a Western passport, but they do not want Western nationalism or agree with that. And that's a very strange setup. You're like, how is that possible? Because the world has been divided into two halves. So if you are from the dark half, if you have been classified from the dark half, what can give you access to the brighter side of things, which is the passport? And on the other side, you're chaos. You might be traveling anywhere in the world. Most people over here have US passports. When you travel with the US passports, you're treated differently. But if you are traveling with a passport from another country, which is believed to be in the dark section of the world, you have different treatments. If you have a US passport, you might be allowed to walk out of the airport. You don't need a visa. But if you are from the other side of the world, there's a problem. You cannot leave that place. You'll be checked and rechecked again and again. Those things happen. I mean, I've faced those kind of things, and it's pretty common. And that is this idea of globalization. So the concept of nationalism is going down. One, because the more we push from here, the darker side, away, what that does, people have group mentality which is getting stronger. A person in Libya might not be a Libyan anymore, but that person today is identifying more with refugees. There was a time in the world when being a refugee, or if a country could claim that with pride, that we have so many refugees, we are a refuge for people all over the globe. That was pride. Today, it's shocking when I hear the word and certain television stations, channels, not station channels, I won't name it, because I don't want to go into that debate. The word horde is a derogatory term, is used for a refugee. And when I heard this word mentioned a couple of times, I just went on Google and typed the word refugees and went into images. And it's shocking, because the last thing you can imagine is the word horde for the people who are photographed across a barbed wire and they're trying to cross it. It's shame might be a strong word, shame, but I think it's okay if I use it. I'm in university. That when refugees are considered a burden, thinking that United States is the country which has the huge responsibility of, or they're doing a huge favor of settling refugees, the horde of refugees, which are going to come and disrupt our way of life. In reality, most refugees are settled in third world developing countries, not over here. So when I would hear this debate about this globalization, that refugees being considered a burden, problem. These are some of the points which I wanted to emphasize on, so that I can have more time for question and answers if you have any of those. That how the world, again, two parts, the dark and the light, because I teach law and war, because I'm fascinated with this idea that on one side you have organized, on the other side you have chaos, and the world exists between these two extremes. Some places it leans more towards law, in other places it leans more towards chaos, and we tend to miss. For example, many a times when Himalayas are in Pakistan, in India and Nepal. When people ask me that, do you guys have winter in Pakistan? I was like, yes, I live in the base of the Himalayas. So yes, that's the highest mountains in the world, because they think that Pakistan is also a desert because people do not know. When I was coming to the US, I had to study US Constitution, the British customs and usages, Turkish Constitution, German, all of those things. Over here, nobody had any idea what the Constitution in Pakistan was, because they didn't have to, because that's the gap between the yellow part of an egg and the white section of an egg. So that's how I look at the world, and if you guys have any questions, when I'm there, I'll be happy to answer. Did I go very quick, or?
Oh, you're doing great. You're at 13 minutes right now.
How exciting. So I think I'll be comfortable over there. I'll just sit over there and then again answer questions. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. All right, wonderful. So we now. Go ahead.
Tell Robert that I'm putting it back on in case he's like dancing around.
Robert, you're about to go back on the screen now.
Okay, I'll stop dancing.
All right. So we have quite a bit of time now for question and answer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that wireless mic, and if you have a question for any of our panelists, I'll kind of run around the. Oh, are you going to do it, Molly? Oh, wonderful. Yes, there's a question right here.
Turn it on. I mean, please turn it on, Molly.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by the white and dark part, referring to the entire world. And I just wanted to ask a simple question. Can the dark and the white work together? Because, or can they live without each other?
No. This is working. Oh, good, it's working. I like my voice when I'm on the mic. Okay.
Higher up, and then you're speaking into it.
Yeah, hello?
Yeah.
Works? Okay.
I'm sorry, was that
Yes. Okay.
question directed at me?
No.
Okay.
That was to the handsome guy on the panel. That's me. I'm a lawyer. I have to brag. Can they work together? They can. Will they be able to work together for the near future? No. with what's happening right now, the way the gap is being created between the dark and the light, and again I'm using that very broadly, not going to happen. It's actually being made difficult for people from one part of the world to enter this part of the world. And the more this happens, the more difficult it gets for people to understand each other. Because if we don't understand each other, we can never be together. We can never work together. Many a times when I meet people, they ask me, are all Pakistanis like you? I mean, do you guys all hate us? Do you guys have Christians in Pakistan? I was like, well, I went to a Catholic school and a Protestant college and then BYU. So I have been around all these places. People do not know. And the more they are ignorant, the more difficult it becomes to combine these two together. So in the near future, I don't see that. I am not the smartest person in the room. I don't have an answer for that. And that's what happens, you see. When people ask me, when I talk about war, and people ask me, how can we stop wars? My answer is, you can never stop wars. You can decrease them to a certain extent. But you can never stop them because we are humans. This is part of us. This is chaos is within us. And I kind of lean more towards the imperative theory of law, which is a herd of wolves is quiet and all at one than so many men, unless and until they have a stronger force to compel them to see the right reason. So who's going to show them the right reason? That makes it complicated. So there will be chaos, there will be war. We might be able to minimize it to a certain extent. But no, we can only search for utopia. We're not going to have utopia. Sorry.
Right. Anybody else? Anybody else?
Yes. Yeah. Please. And I'm sorry. I don't need to give you all the depressing answers. That's how I see it. I really apologize for that.
Well, I think I just need some understanding. The thing is that Pocatello is one of the regions in the state that is welcoming refugees. And if we want to welcome refugees, we have to deal with that perception of the white and the dark world. And people are running from real difficult situations into places where they can get some refuge, they can be taken care of. And they go through so much trauma before they even arrive. And the situation in the United States is, please don't come here. Do you also see a situation where that chaos could start here and people from other countries will say, please, Americans, don't come here?
Economics. That will play an important role. And when I think about Pocatello, universities play a very important role. The more international students you have, the more people get exposed to international cultures. Let me give you a statistic. When the election was taking place, people were scared. They think the refugees are coming to take over everything. The chances of someone, a US citizen, getting killed by a refugee is 1 in 3.6 billion. The chances of someone in the US killed by a Muslim in the US is 1 in 2.74 million. So that's a very high percentage. But the thing is, we were told that this was an existential threat. So again, it is not an existential threat. The more international students are here, the more awareness comes in. And that awareness can be a pushing force for the politicians to make sure that things like that do not happen. Now, after that, the second one is US being a global power. Why do people want to come? This is the land of the immigrants, and this is a very powerful country and provides so many opportunities. Will the shift change? I don't see it happening in the near future because the more chaos increases, the more societies which could have had hope of becoming stronger that hope is going away. And the more the hope goes away, the more difficult it is for a society to stand up on its 2 feet and say, no, you cannot come to my country. That's the problem.
Go ahead, Malliga.
I have a question for Robert. So, can you hear me, Robert?
Yes.
So, the idea of America first is nothing unusual right now going on in Europe. We have the rise of right-wing populist movements in Germany, in France, in Hungary, Poland, Brexit in the UK. And it's similar sentiments, fear of refugees, an unwillingness almost to lead on the on the world stage in terms of democratic values. You're being threatened, like democracies are threatened. So what does it mean for the international order, this rise of populist movements, especially in the West? Do we create a vacuum? And if we do, who's going to step into this leadership vacuum? Like, what's the future of the world order?
It's a great question. And first of all, absolutely, this rise of populism and the shift away from a clear democratic mindset in the West is significant. I would argue that we're seeing similar upsurges of nationalism and deep distrust of others beyond the West as well, and that certainly was my experience in the Arab Gulf. That sort of untrusting, closed off attitude is occurring widely. What does that mean for the international order? Well, I think international orders are not something that maintain themselves, right? And there is effort involved in maintaining them, in enforcing the rules of the game when they're violated with regularity. I think even before the uptick in populism, there was a big problem with the lack of willingness, particularly on the part of the United States, to enforce those rules. Now there's a lack of clarity that a number of key states, including the United States, in the West actually believe in and support the basic ideological principles of the liberal order. Yeah, I think that does leave a vacuum. Can we move through this period until things stabilize without someone filling that vacuum and creating a really dangerous conflict? Yes, and I hope that's the case. But I also started out my talk with that cautionary tale because I think that these are the moments that are ripe for large scale conflict. And if that happens, then I think the answer to the question of what does the future global order look like is something that is determined by the conflict that unfolds, right? Because the function of conflicts like that are to tear down the existing order into which a new one is created. And the outcome of those conflicts, it's possible that the U.S. could emerge from a conflict, or the West could emerge from a conflict like that in a position to build a new and better order. It's also possible that it could see other states on the ascendancy.
So as a follow-up question, we've seen in your graph that the U.S. military might is so great. There's no country in the world that is able to go one-on-one into the ring with the U.S. without losing. So in terms of Russian interference in election and undermining trust in democracies, not just in the U.S., but also in Europe, how does these indirect tactics, like where could other countries such as China, Russia, or other potential emerging powers make the U.S. more vulnerable or attack the power of the U.S.?
Right. So the operations by Russia are part of Russian national security strategy and its approach to hybrid warfare. It understands within the new strategic context power to be deployed in various different ways, and it knows full well that it can't confront the United States in a conventional military conflict directly. But it has at its disposal other approaches, and it's sowing seeds of uncertainty, of mistrust within the American system, and others in the West is a significant blow. It's a significant threat. Because if it can force a decline of the United States de facto by causing the United States to drive that itself, then it's a huge strategic win, and I think that's clearly what the Kremlin is doing. And I would expect that other powers, China included, will learn lessons from the strategic success on the part of Russia.
Can I add to that point? First Gulf War, 1991, the belief was that war killed or buried the ghost of Vietnam. Then the second war in 2003, when that started, the ghost of Vietnam is back in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's back. And then, as I mentioned yesterday, the war of the future is going to be civil. So direct military intervention, no, that won't be possible. But indirect warfare, the way it happened throughout the Cold War and different regions of the world, indirect is always a threat, because when you are as powerful as the US military, it makes you very difficult to fight in unconventional warfare, while you have to make sure that you step on as less toes as possible in some of those regions. So that is a danger, because those areas can become a trap, and an organized military can get stuck in there.
I actually have a question too for Malliga, to shift gears a little bit. You mentioned one of the things that keeps CEDAW from being implemented in the U.S. is things like requirements to ban the execution of people who are minors when they committed a crime, execution of mentally challenged persons, things of that nature. We're starting to see some of those laws in the U.S. change, thanks to Supreme Court decisions over the last 20 years. Do you think if those legal obstacles are removed, that there's a potential for U.S. ratification, or do you think it still falls into the realm of, the big specter and fear of foreign law interfering with the U.S. will keep it from ever being considered under the current political regime in Washington?
The U.S. is not going to ratify those laws and those treaties. It's not going to happen. I think there's domestic opposition that bring up these issues. Like CEDAW has been very imposed because the argument was made it would mandate abortion, which is not true. But there's always the second. Well, there are two things. The first one is this big conspiracy that the UN will come in and send its soldiers. The US does not have soldiers. And take over the US government, and it will be a world government, and the US can do what it wants to do. So there's always this ominous UN fear. And if you're not happy with it, you should consider and check out your nearest United Nations Association chapter. Or start one in Pocatello, there is not one. So it's this fear of foreign intervention. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child, one argument has been, if we ratify the convention, the UN will come and arrest parents who will slap their children. Which my response is well, if you're worried that you get arrested for slapping children, we might want to talk about not slapping your children first. The second part is that the US has never considered human rights something that applies to the US. Human rights is something considered as an export to far-flung countries to establish the rule of law, to bring in civil liberties, to bring in democracy. It's something for others. The US is exceptional. it already has human rights. It doesn't need to ratify those treaties because it already adheres to the treaties. And to a certain extent, that's right? The U.S. has an okay human rights status, depending who you are. However, the U.S. discourse on human rights is a civil rights discourse and a discourse focused on negative rights. So what the government should not do, you should not be arrested, you should get free trial, you should not be stopped from voting. A lot of the human rights discourse, especially in the second generation, socioeconomic cultural rights, are positive rights. The government needs to provide something to realize those human rights. Access to welfare, health care, access to work, sick leave. That is much more critical, and it goes opposed to the U.S., where we don't see a strong, actually there is no left party in the U.S. The Democrats are good Christian Democrats in Europe, or good conservatives in the U.K. There is no tradition of a strong left party that fought for this idea that the state should provide basic rights, benefits, and takes care of its citizens. So it's like a mixture of things that really prevents this idea, like the type of right that human rights are, the fear of the UN, but also that human rights is squarely set in the idea of foreign policy, not domestic politics.
Yes, go ahead.
Has there been, you won't be able to hear this. Has there been a pushback from state legislators against the CETA communities, the way there has been for the pushback of state legislators, legislatures about sanctuary cities? I'm thinking specifically of the measures imposed by Texas against communities like Austin and San Antonio.
So far not. I'm not aware, well maybe, but I'm not aware of any. What I've been more aware is actually the opposite, where state legislatures, especially in democratic controlled states, have issued resolutions calling for the ratification of CETA. They are usually, they are great in intent, but they are usually useless because they are resolution and they expire and they don't have this way. CETA probably also flies under the radar because it's an emerging movement. There are only 7 ordinance cities. It's a very complicated progress. It's not something like Sanctuary City that is so easily polarized. Like making CETA into a one-punch line is much harder than to do it for refugees or for other immigration issues.
I'm looking around the room and I see so many students, and Molly, thank you. Go ahead. Yeah.
I had a question for you, Shadman. I was just, this is awful. I guess I was just kind of wondering how we as a society increase acceptance of diverse people if we continue to push this idea that there are 2 inherently and completely different parts of the world.
Students play a very important role. The more students come in to the US, the more interaction increases. Let me give you an example. When my wife joined me in St. George, we were flying from St. George to Salt Lake for a lecture at BYU, and my wife wanted to pray on the plane. And I was like, no, don't do that. We are in St. George, because the last thing I want you to do is cover your head and recite something in Arabic. I was like, I struggle so hard to be here, and I don't want to be arrested in Salt Lake City, like someone reciting Arabic. Why? And if I'm in Pocatello, I will be comfortable. Because over here, there's such a huge number, and has been a huge number of students from Muslim, Arab, African countries, that it's more accepted compared to St. George. So that the more it increases, like even in Salt Lake, it's going to get better. So students are the first line which gives access to understanding other cultures. But the problem is, as I mentioned before, Homeland Security. Yes, it's all important, but when you make getting visas difficult for students to come over here, that link is minimized. In countries like Pakistan, for example, getting admissions in the US or in the top institute in US is not the difficult part for many of the students there. The real struggle is getting a visa to come over here. That is the real struggle. I mean, there are doctors over there, they pass all their exams and stuff, they can't come and work over here because they won't get a visa. So that needs to be understood. And one last point, and I'm sorry, I'm a lawyer, I talk a lot. I really apologize, so I'm sorry.
You were the most efficient on time of the three, yeah.
I try to make it look good. I always tell my students that I teach such depressing things. I have to throw some kind of funny stuff in there, like suicide bomber jokes. I'm not going to do that now. It creates such a problem when people apply for visas to come over here. And when 9/11 happened, there was something called the special registration. I went through that, and imagine in US we have free exercise and establishment clause and all the other those things. If you were from a Muslim country or a Muslim majority country, there were 25 countries on that list. One was North Korea. They just added it just to add some color in there. So 24 countries were Muslim. So we had to go to the nearest immigration office and prove that we were clean. And if we couldn't, we could be arrested. And the list was composed of countries with Muslim majorities. And then next year it died down. Was that legal as far as the Constitution is concerned? No. Because I teach law. I have a little bit of understanding of the Constitution, tiny bit. No. But it happened. Even there was the issue of removing attorney-client privilege for people who are alleged to be terrorists. Alleged.
And I think a thing maybe to look into is Europe faced this very question about trust and understanding others after World War II. And I think one of the big accomplishments of the European Union, despite all the crises going on, what they achieved is that if you come up to a German or a French or an Italian and say, hey, guess what? You're going to go to war against the German. They will go say, why? There's not this idea. And how this happened, there are several things. Sister cities, and they exist on an international scale. In Europe, it's easier because it's closer together. And even the tiniest village has a sister city in France, for example. France used to be called the inherited enemy of Germany. So just because you were German, French people were automatically your enemy. And you have exchanges with the local Oompa Oompa bands who go and play, with the local orchestra. You have exchanges in school where when you learn French, you go to a French high school. And the same is continued on the college level, where you have Erasmus, where you can study at any university for a year within the Erasmus program, where you have exchanges. And I think creating this really close connections where you create friends in other cultures is instrumental. And that's why I tell my students, do not go to a country you already know. Go to a country that really challenges your intercultural understanding. And that might even be the UK for some. But putting yourself in a situation where you're not comfortable, where you have forced to learn about others is, I think, really important.
All right. Add something over here. And there's also, with empires, the borders are not fluid. The borders are fluid, which means for 50 years, you might be Germans who speak French, and for the next 50 years, you might be French who speak German. So it goes back and forth. So that also plays a very important role in developing that understanding on the peripheries, and then later on things change. So that's a perfect example.
I believe we have time for one more question over there.
I'm sorry, I'm the lawyer in the room. Everyone is trying to ask me questions, and I'm trying to be as politically correct as possible.
Shadman, I want to come back to what we were talking yesterday. Is it in our education system, and I'm talking worldwide, we're getting so specialized that, say, I'm just going to do physics. I don't get any training as to how does physics relate to music or to agriculture, something. You talk about the international students. Remember we talked a multidisciplinary approach from mathematical, economic, all the way up to theological. We need to have inputs from all of that. It's going to be hard learning because, I don't like math. I want to do music. But the thing you're saying with the internationals is each of those is like a different discipline. So shouldn't we be starting around the world in our education once we get our language native, if it's English or Russian, but as we advance, we have to learn some of the other languages, we have to learn some of the other disciplines, then we'll be able to relate to anybody. Granted, if we say there's 15 disciplines from mathematical to theological, at least if we do about 10, if we're forced to do 10 up to a certain point, we'll have that background when we see somebody different. We have enough of overlap that we won't just think, oh, this is a scary thing, this is different. Can you elaborate on that, Sumar?
Let me explain this in another manner. The British Council and American centers. When I was growing up in the early 80s, late 70s and early 80s, there used to be American centers in different parts of the world. If you wanted to come to the US, that there was no internet, so you go to the nearest American center. You just walk in and you talk to the education counselor over there, and then they talk to you about different opportunities an international student you can have in the United States. Most of them are closed, or now if you go there, you have to go through a bomb-protected site and you have to prove everything that you have to. So that's the access is minimized. Same was the case with British Council. So you would go to a British Council library in different parts of the world, again, mostly in Commonwealth countries, and that would expose you to not just the British books, but also the education section of the British system, where they answer all those kind of questions, where the connections were established. So that was one thing. Those things have decreased. One, internet has taken over many of those things. Now, as far as the courses and subjects and all those things are concerned, universities in the United States, that my experience is, are more concerned about enrollments. The higher the enrollments, the more money, and I'm sorry I'm saying this in a university, thank God I'm leaving tomorrow, so I'm saying so the more the enrollments, the more important it is for that university. So in that sense, somewhere down the line, that real emphasis on grooming, developing that understanding of globalization or understanding of all these cultures, the emphasis decreases. And that is what I have, in my experience, and again, I'm just only one person. I've been in the US for 18 years, and I don't want to sound like the president when I keep on saying my experience, or I'm saying it. I'm just, my own personal tiny bit experience is that the more emphasis is being placed on enrollments rather than quality of what can come from the outside United States. So I hope I can answer this question this way without going into too much non-political correct details.
I think there's an important part to that where every one of you can actually help is there has been discussion in Idaho on the higher levels in politics to get away with learning foreign languages to be counted as a general education requirement. So if there's something that comes up and is being raised in your local politics, that's the time where everyone needs to speak up and say, knowing foreign languages is the key to understanding a culture. It's the key to understanding a different religion. It's the crucial building block of building intercultural competencies. Not just because we are in a globalized world and you probably need to speak a foreign language in order to be hireable if you want to rise up through the ranks, right? But taking away languages for low enrollment purposes or because it's not seen as necessary is one of the threats to intercultural understanding, as you just have so eloquently laid out.
Right, and I'm sure we could keep talking about this all day, but we're unfortunately at times.
One last point. I'm sorry. One last.
Go for it.
Fierce note in it.
When I teach my students religion and war and all those things, I always tell them the reason of course you're getting credits, but someday you might be the person who has to push a button, pull a trigger, or sign a paper which is going to kill someone. So when you do that, at that moment you have to understand that someone in another part of the world is also a human being who has his family or her family. So that 1 second, think about it, that's the goal that we try to teach, and then that's it. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you everyone so much for coming.
Thanks,
Molly. Oh, thank you. That was very, very well done.
Robert, you might log off now.
Yeah, no problem at all.
You want to go off?
Thank you. Take care.